Hey y'all, I'm Sunny Shell, and tonight we're going to talk about neuroscience. We love your questions and try to answer them all, but super chats take priority. So sit back, buckle up, and let's get to the sunny spot on Skeptic Haven. Hey everyone, I hope everyone has had a really good weekend and you're ready to get back into the sunny spot. Tonight I'm really excited for my guest, Homozygoat. So if you wouldn't mind, if you'll just tell everybody who you are and kind of what you do.
Hey, again, thank you for having me. Much appreciated. My online handle is Homozygoat. My government name is Marcus, so you can use whichever one you wish. I'm currently a fourth year PhD candidate in cellular and molecular biology at the University of Vermont. My online presence has been really governed by the pandemic, but currently sort of branching out into sort of other forms of scientific content. I do a variety of different things online. I've been in political debates. I've been in philosophy of science seminars. I've essentially spent a lot of my time online teaching people, how to keep themselves safe from not just COVID, but all the other germs floating around right now, and kind of giving people an inside look into what academia is like, how the institution functions, its problems, solutions, and kind of the contemporary issues of academia. It's something that people don't really see very much of. So I like to kind of style myself as a scientist that is really accessible to you. So I'm kind of your pocket scientist if you ever have any questions about things that I have expertise in. That's a pretty, I guess, a quick and dirty summation of what I do online.
Well, that's awesome. In that introduction, now I feel like, oh, some of the questions that we talked about backstage are like, let's throw them out. Let's go with this stuff. But we named the show Are We Our Brains? And so I'd like to just start with that. That's kind of broad. But are we our brains or are we something else?
Yeah, so I mean, to kind of dig into this a little bit more, one thing I didn't just include in my background, my dissertation work is essentially in neuroscience. So right now, I function as a neuroscientist. My actual degree is a little bit more broad, but my specialty right now is currently neuroscience. So I think when we kind of think about that notion of are we just a product of what our brain cells are doing? Uh, to some extent, we are, and I think people kind of underestimate the impacts that their biology has on them, not just with their brains, but how other parts of the body kind of interface with the brain. Right? There's all sorts of new and exciting connections being discovered between other parts of the body, such as the gut and the gut bacteria, bone. Kidneys, pretty much a lot of your your organs, if not all of them, have some sort of input back into the brain to kind of help the brain make decisions and do the things that it normally kind of does on autopilot. So in a way, we are kind of just this, like, I kind of describe the human body as a Gundam for our brain. We're just this fleshy shell for this supercomputer in our heads that does a lot of really incredible stuff. But one of the things that we really haven't had a chance to crack and understand to the extent that we'd like is the idea of consciousness. The idea of how we're able to kind of understand our own existence, realize that we are sentient, that we're different from all of the other organisms, and kind of go about decoupling all of that from how our brain actually works and trying to figure out to answer our question, are we really just our brain? So really the TLDR is yes and no. It just kind of depends on what direction you approach the question from. But generally speaking, sometimes people really do underappreciate just how much work their brain is doing for them.
Well, that's a really great way of putting it. One thing that I keep hearing about is talking about that consciousness, because as you know, a lot of people feel that a part of them goes on after they die in some way, and it's amazing how many people believe that. I personally don't, but the reason why is because I haven't seen any credible evidence for that. What I've always said is that consciousness is a product of the brain, and And I also think about all the other organisms, mammals in particular. They're not so far away from us. We have much more cognitive abilities. We're able to, um, to do things like philosophy and the things that we're doing here tonight. But it's interesting how, elephants have a lot of cognitive ability. Apes have a lot of cognitive, even, um, oh, the name, octopus. They've even found that octopus do problem solving and are very good at problem solving. So it kind of feels like we are just like every other brain holding organism. We just happen to be further along. And is that right, wrong, or do you have something else to say about
So that's a really interesting question. I think really just I guess to get a definition out of the way. Um, we kind of describe consciousness as what's called an emergent property, at least as it pertains to humans. And I think, in relation to other animals, say, companion animals like our cats, our dogs, or, animals that we kind of think of as more like zoo animals, the non-human primates and others. We're learning that they have more perception than we've absolutely given them credit for. But it's not really something that we've been able to sort of compare one to one. Like it's not ever really been a thing to say like, oh yeah, we're at the top of the consciousness chain, and that all other beings are below us. It's more that every being is so different in terms of how their brains are wired and what they're able to perceive versus what we're able to perceive, that it's really not comparable. One of the aspects of this that is, I think, pretty common knowledge is that dogs, for example, they have a robust sense of smell. They smell things that we can't. Some animals can see wavelengths of color that we don't, or see in different wavelengths of light entirely than what we do. So really the brains of animals are just so vastly different that they're kind of in their own sphere. And you know not to put humans at the center of the universe, but our consciousness from our perspective is unlike any other one. But at the same time, that anthropocentric viewpoint of humans are the center of the universe because we are human, that can lead us to some biases that I think really lead us to underappreciate the biology of other animals and other life forms. I think going back to your original point about whether or not the belief in religion or spirituality, perhaps more broadly, is a consequence of our brains. Again, I think that's I think for now, the available evidence that I've seen, and I've dug into this, I think quite a bit, says most likely yes, but obviously, that can't be 100%, and it's really hard to even throw a percentage on that. One of the research avenues that I really advocate for and I really pound the table for is understanding of psychedelic substances. So things like psilocybin, LSD, ketamine, MDMA, DMT, like these things in a research setting, not in the Joe Rogan podcast type of setting, but in an actual like laboratory or with people who are supervised by medical professionals. The use of these substances can actually give us some insight we never had before into the human brain, our consciousness, and kind of how we arrive at some of those belief systems. If we try to replicate religious or spiritual moments in a more scientific setting with these substances, then we might learn something that we didn't know before about. Okay, is this really biologically generated? Is this coming from within our brains? Can we reproduce it? Which is a hallmark of good science. Or is there something else that we can't necessarily perceive or understand yet about our brains? So that's a new and emerging area of research that's ongoing, that we don't have too much information about solely because of political reasons, because of the drug war and the legalization of these substances. But recently there was actually a big study for depression and the use of psilocybin to treat treatment-resistant depression with some promising results along with some side effects. But That was one of the first like recent pieces of good clinical trial work to actually incorporate those substances into our scientific understanding. So almost in a way, we can circle back to the spiritual roots of our predecessors, when they documented their religious rituals with some of these substances. Native Americans, other indigenous people have certainly incorporated a lot of these substances into their culture. I think that's actually an opportunity for us to gain some more understanding by almost looking at what religious people have done over time and use that to our advantage.
Right. Yeah. There actually, I just saw in the chat a question. See if I can find it. It was by Kat the Humanist, and it's what are those side effects you were talking about? And I'm curious as well. You said that there are some good things, but also some issues.
Yeah. So in that clinical trial, in terms of the side effects, they actually, interestingly enough, in the people who were in the psilocybin group, they had some new onset suicidal ideation, which is definitely something noteworthy and something that needs some addressing for sure. It's kind of difficult in a situation like that when you're trying to design a clinical trial around something like psilocybin, when you're trying to do what's called a double blind study, where neither the physicians nor the actual participants know whether they're getting the real deal or a placebo, because something that's psychoactive like psilocybin, when you're on it, you're on it. So it's unblinded really the moment you actually get it in reality. So it's going to be difficult to kind of extract, okay, and how much of that is from the nocebo effect. If you're on it and then you expect bad things to happen, then subsequently bad things will happen, where you kind of manifest these things from, again, your brain, your understanding, your perception of the situation, while it's being altered by a psychoactive substance. It's kind of two levels deep, but that's something that's going to be really difficult to sort of untangle from the use of psychoactive substances for scientific study. But I think perhaps more broadly, there are some studies that are trying to incorporate more active placebos to try and counteract that, where you feel something in your body, but it's not necessarily going to put you in such an altered mental state like psilocybin, LSD, ketamine actually would. I think the other side effects were less psychological, and they were more like nausea, headache, dizziness, things like that. Things that were more common, less severe in severity, and less are more typical, I guess, across all of the things that we do, whether it's a vaccine, taking a pill, stuff like that.
That's interesting. And as you're saying that, I'm thinking there's actually a lot of drugs for depression and other things that do that can have a side effect of actually increasing those and have suicidal ideations. And so you have to be very careful when taking them, and get with your doctor often. So I can imagine that if they are able to create a drug that can be taken, it would be by prescription only, I would imagine, and it would be highly monitored to offset some of those things. Is at least what I would imagine.
Yeah, I think in the initial phases, when there's a good body of evidence that is derived from clinical trials, then I think that's going to be how it's introduced, from the scientific / academic perspective. Currently, if we kind of assess the state of things politically, there are, I think now two places. I want to say Oregon, and I don't know if the legislation actually just passed in midterms in Denver, but I know at least one place has fully decriminalized the possession of magic mushrooms, which contain psilocybin. So I think there's a bit of a social grassroots style upswelling for these things that could actually help people, that may be a substitute for kind of the knee jerk reflex of a lot of physicians to just throw antidepressants at people having depression, PTSD, and other psychological / mental illness issues. And that's not to knock on those medications, right? There's actually a ton of evidence showing that they do help people. That's why they're the first line treatment. But it's also worth noting that they don't necessarily work for everybody, right? Everybody's brains are wired differently in ways we don't really quite understand. So I think that is a sign academia needs to have more of an open mind and be more forceful of advocates for alternative therapies for treatment resistant depression like this. So it was really encouraging, again, to see that trial actually come out. First thing that I've seen in a long time as far as psychedelic research is concerned.
That's really interesting. So back in a previous life, many years ago, I worked with severe persistent mental illness, a lot of patients with that. And I taught what's called a RAP class, which stands for Wellness Recovery and Action Plan. And one of the biggest things that we had an issue with was people maintaining these patients in particular, maintaining their drugs, their prescribed drugs. Because what we heard from them is, I feel like a guinea pig. Every time they give me a new drug, it's I have these terrible side effects, or they have to adjust the dosages, and then they say, oh, that's not working, we're going to put you on something else, and I go through the whole thing and all over again. And that can be extremely problematic, because people then feel like, you know what, I'm just going to keep hearing my hallucinations and seeing my visions, and I will just be on the outside of society. I'm wondering, and this is not where I was going with our original show, but I am very curious. Is anyone looking to see if psychedelics might be able to help with more severe mental health problems than depression, like paranoid schizophrenia, for instance?
Yeah, I think that's going to be a context specific thing. It's really, I think, going to be very variable depending on the condition. If we're talking about more severe forms of mental illness, such as bipolar disorders, paranoid schizophrenia, things like that, it's going to be difficult, I think, to assess that with the current availability of evidence right now. I think there's potential. I think there's probably potential for people who have tried the current standards of care and haven't really been able to control things all that well. I think, again, a lot of these mental illnesses are rooted in the ways neural networks in the brain are wired, and how different parts of the brain, different neuronal nuclei kind of interact with each other and carry out the executive functions of the brain. So the potential that a lot of these psychedelic substances have is to kind of change how these brain cells, these neurons are wired, form new connections, or maybe, cause some other connections that really shouldn't necessarily be there, to kind of calm down and not be sort of in this, on sending signal state all the time. So I think it kind of has the potential to maybe at least attenuate some of the symptoms of more severe mental illness. I think, again, another component of our understanding that's really lacking is how different psychedelic substances do this differently. If you were to compare, how does LSD change the brain wiring versus how does psilocybin do it, you wouldn't really have all that much information aside from, lived experiences of people who've just, consumed it recreationally to use as data. And that's not to say that places like Erowid, a hub of people recounting their experiences with all sorts of recreational substances for the purpose of disclosure and safety. I think that's a halfway decent, a valid source of information in terms of used experience, but ultimately that's kind of anecdata, and that's not really the quality of evidence that we'd be looking for to actually justify the use of these things in clinical trials. However, I think a way to kind of get around all of that might be this right to try idea, where, again, if people have really gone through the standard of care and what they have going on is pretty refractory, then I would argue if they are able to consent to it, or if they're not, then if their providers are able to consent to it in a supervised scenario, that we might be able to utilize these things to see if there's any improvement, any remediation of symptoms of these mental illnesses. But I think that is going to take a more broad cultural shift in society for people to be more active in that kind of advocacy, right? Because especially within academia, people who are, again, pounding the table for this, they're kind of viewed as like, oh, how much acid did you do in college? They're just viewed as a bunch of hippies or junkies themselves. But in reality, it's been something that's been culturally and politically suppressed. And I think science and academia would be foolish to not pursue these substances to their full potential. But that being said, if there's no evidence, then there's no evidence that they work. But you can't really say that because there's currently a lack of trying. So,
right. And it seems like there was it was starting in a direction where people were, or professors and scientists and so forth, were starting to do that. But with Timothy Leary and the fear of drugs. Drugs are practically the devil. It changed all of that. But I appreciate you going on that kind of side tangent with me, because that's kind of a personal interest for me. But getting back onto our original topic, I was wondering about, right now we have a whole lot of conspiracy theories. Some are extremely damaging to human health. I mean, if you just look at the pandemic, we had millions of people die. And even after the vaccine came about, because there's so many people, even today, I have people who tell me, I will never take the vaccine, or like people don't realize that the vaccine is just the government, blah, blah, blah. So in that context, how does our brain allow us to think of these, to come up with these conspiracy theories? Or maybe another way of putting that is, why does our brain are we more hardwired? Are humans more hardwired to accept those types of things in our brain? Does that make sense, what I'm asking you?
Yeah. No, your question makes good sense. I think you can approach it from a couple different directions. A question like this, I think, is not going to have any singular right answer. I think in reality, it's going to be a multitude of contributing factors that all just kind of create this perfect storm, especially as we've lived through it during the COVID-19 pandemic, and we'll continue to live through it as time goes on, especially with even more chronic issues like climate change and any other pandemics that might pop up in the meantime. So I think more broadly speaking, we can kind of talk about this sort of like pattern recognition thing. I don't know if you've seen, I think it's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, but the dude with like the cork board with all the different pictures and the red thread kind of connecting them all with the words Pepe Sylvia written on them. That's kind of how we perceive conspiracy theorists. But I think even as that meme kind of indicates, what underlies that kind of stereotype of crazy tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorist is it's the word apophenia. It's this tendency to notice connections between things that are not related. As an example, when Elon bought Twitter, I noticed a bunch of things being given to me by the algorithm that I'd never really asked for, and a bunch of them were like QAnon conspiracy theories. And I just dug into it for fun to be like, okay, what wild things are they suggesting or are happening underneath me? And it was this wild story about how the deceased frontman of Linkin Park, Chester Bennington, was actually the secret son of John Podesta, Hillary Clinton's campaign chief or whatever, and how Chester Bennington was actually taken out when he was about to expose the whole sex trafficking ring or whatever. And under that definition of apophenia, right, the pattern that they thought was related that really wasn't, was the fact that Chester Bennington kind of looked like John Podesta a little bit, just in terms of physical appearance. But that one little connection, that one erroneous connection, looped him into this massive, government cabal of, sex traffickers. So I think when we kind of start to think about the question, why do our brains really like, latching onto these things? Why do the conspiracy theorists have such a strong, connection to this? It's because I think their brains are very wired for pattern recognition. Their brains are very wired to try and connect dots and inappropriately ascribe these things meaning when there is no meaning underlying them. So I think that's one approach. Another thing that I've learned pretty recently is that with a lot of people who are ardent pushers and believers of conspiracy theories, there's usually some sort of traumatic issue rooted in their material life that underlies it. A lot of loss of family, a lot of death of friends, or they saw a friend or a family member, or maybe they themselves had a adverse reaction to a vaccine once, therefore now they kind of extrapolate that to all vaccines. There's usually some sort of underlying thing. Sometimes it can just be mental illness. I mean, that not to exclude that from the conversation. That's absolutely in the mix too.
Mhm.
But there's usually some sort of trauma or other difficult series of life events that these people are trying to cope with and deal with. And conspiracy theories are ways that they almost just rationalize the unfair things that are happening to them in their life. And actually, a really good example of this would be a lab tech that I used to work with when I was working on my undergraduate degree back in 2012 through 2015. Um, Love her to death. She was awesome, really good at being a scientist, but she was actually anti-vaccine, and not because she believed that the government was trying to kill people, but it's because her father died of cancer very early in her life. I think her father died at the age of 40, and that was something that she kind of just found on the internet that the typical childhood vaccines increase the risk for this particular cancer that her father happened to have died from. So she took that traumatic experience she dealt with in her life and rationalized that away by blaming vaccines for it. And therefore, that kind of got her foot into the door, and that started a rejection of all vaccines, and it kind of broadened out from there for her in terms of dietary changes, exercise, food consumption. The conspiracy theorism kind of slowly started to grow and permeate from that original starting point of vaccines that was ultimately grounded in the loss of her father very early in her life. So it really just helps rationalize all of the awful things that kind of happen to people in the world these days. I think finally, to kind of loop some neuroscience back into it, there are definitely involvements of that like reward pathway on our brain when we kind of dig into some of these things, when we think we know something that other people don't. There's kind of this invocation of the reward pathways in our brain. We kind of get that little dopamine hit, like, oh yeah, like I just connected these dots like that. Yeah, I understand now. That understanding, that learning makes me feel really good. I want to go look into this issue even more, see if I can figure anything else out, see if anybody else is involved in the giant conspiracy. So,
Mhm.
I think once the wiring is kind of set in, I don't want to necessarily call it addiction, but it's addiction like. I think it's adjacent. When we talk about how people kind of diving down these rabbit holes, they're connecting the patterns, connecting the dots, and when it hits, like when it really just hits their brain, they get that reward, that they get that sensation of yes, do more of this, coming from their brain, coming from that reward pathway. So I think that kind of like loops it back in now with there is, I think, an active biological component, but the constant pinging of the reward pathway ultimately comes from environmental and social cues and causes. To really, I think, make this more of a holistic answer to that question, it's really just a combination of everything. It's not any one singular thing. And actually, just someone in my chat mentioned withdrawing from it can actually be pretty difficult too. It's um, again probably adjacent to addiction in that respect. If you're to try and detox somebody from conspiracy theories, you would want to cut them off from bad sources of information, but you might find out that person kind of has a compulsion to log onto Twitter and doom scroll their favorite Twitter accounts, or go watch a bunch of InfoWars videos or something like that. So it really does just get really hardwired into people, and that's why it takes so long, and it takes so many professionals to almost like deprogram people, because it gets hard coded into their brain wiring after long enough.
Yeah, I've actually heard that for some in the that kind of came awake with Trump. They were like in that cult, and then they've come awake from that. But trying to get out of that has been a very painful experience. And I completely agree with you. There's multiple different aspects coming to that, such as the just cognitive dissonance. We don't want to think that we've been wrong, especially when we have kind of a tribe that has come around us.
Mm-hmm.
And to think that people that are that they trust, that they have respect in, that they look up to, are also wrong, that can be extremely painful, an extremely painful process to go through. So I completely agree with you. So I do have a question here from Wes. He wanted to get this in.
Mm-hmm.
He says, here we go. Is hypnosis bunk as is as is it pseudoscience or any truth to it? So is it either pseudoscience or is it not pseudoscience?
Yeah, so I think it kind of depends on what angle you're approaching it from. I think in culture, if we're talking about hypnosis, we're always used to seeing, like in the cartoons, swinging the pocket watch back and forth and the swirly black and white spiral that we all stare into, and now we're under the command of our hypnotist, forced to do their bidding, kind of like a cartoon villain almost in a way. And that's obviously, I think, a pretty comical representation of what hypnosis actually could be used for. Definitely when it comes to like the effects of hypnotism in a controlled setting, if we're talking actual valid scientific research using this, there's absolutely effects that hypnosis does have on the brain. You can actually look at components of the nervous system and how that kind of changes certain measurable outputs of what the body does. For example, if you want to talk about the autonomic nervous system, or kind of processes in your brain that are running on autopilot, like making your heart beat, breathing, the constriction or relaxation of the muscles that control your pupils, so your pupils either dilate or constrict. There's a lot of different things that again are running on autopilot in your brain, and hypnosis can affect brain activity. That's been, I think, pretty well documented. You can absolutely measure things like blood pressure, respiratory rate, heart rate variability, things like that, to kind of perceive these things. So I think it does have measurable biological effects. The question is, are any of those really significant at all? And I think in most contexts, I would say not really, probably not. But, I think if we're kind of skirting towards the pseudoscience line a little bit more, right, another common context of the hypnotism question is, hey, are people who are attending churches or congregating in cult-like situations such as Jonestown, as an example, or even people online who are like following big conspiracy theorists and the QAnon crowd, QAnon John, among others, following like the leaders. We're expecting Q himself to bring about the storm. There's almost a hypnotism aspect there too, because they're just kind of waiting in a trance, kind of like you were alluding to before, for messages to come on down, or they're in this headspace where they're very suggestible. And really, I think that's what kind of underlies a lot of this notion of like contemporary cultural hypnosis is suggestibility, right? I think you, Sonny, you actually mentioned that from your perspective, when you're evaluating whether or not you believe in something, you're looking for evidence, and you're looking for a threshold and quality of evidence that it makes you more or less likely to believe in a particular thing or idea. And I think the more suggestible people are, the more likely they may be to believe in what someone might want them to believe. With respect to hypnotism, I think within the scientific community, that's kind of something they've been trying to quantify or measure, numerically, is how suggestible is a person, and does the act of trying to hypnotize somebody actually alter their suggestibility. And that's kind of where it gets a little unclear and a little pseudoscientific. It's really different based on methodology of studies, the participants. If we kind of try to contextualize it in a church, for example, are the congregants being hypnotized by the pastor or the imam or the rabbi? And I think it really just kind of depends, again, on how suggestible those people are and how their brains are wired, right? For some people, again, it might trigger reward pathways, or it might trigger other components of their brain that give them a euphoric or otherwise positive feeling. And so it could be that the people who kind of tend to flock to church are intrinsically more suggestible. That would be a hypothesis that would be plausible. I don't think there's really all that much data one way or the other on it. I'm not sure that's really even an active topic of research right now. But one of the things I will say is, at least in the realm of like political beliefs, I think they've said conservatives have larger amygdalas. So kind of talking from the biological essentialist point of view, the fear center, the amygdala of the brain, tends to be a little bit larger and more active in people who have conservative beliefs. And religion always tends to fall in that conservative worldview. So it could be that there's this suggestibility that's driven more by fear of a scapegoat or an other that's going to upend their tradition, their way of life that's rooted in religion. So they kind of double down on that as a way to sort of suppress or get rid of those negative feelings and emotions that come from the amygdala chiming up. So it's very difficult to approach the hypnotism question, just because, like, again, the quality of the studies and the data are really all over the place. But I think there could be a plausible use for it. It just depends on the question that you're trying to answer. But culturally speaking, it's, I think, less like the cartoons, less like, a powerful person is trying to make you do their bidding, and more just, you might be more suggestible. The way your life is going might make you more open-minded and more perceptive of things like, religion offering you, deliverance or salvation from what you're going through at the time. But also, again, the biology kind of serves to reinforce a lot of the issues with material conditions that are going on in a person's life, I think.
We have another question. This is from Titan. How can we reduce their amygdalas?
I think most of those ways are illegal, so I'm probably not going to mention that very much. It's a nice thought that, if there was a way to tamper the amygdala, I think, I guess the legal ones are called benzodiazepines, just to kind of, calm the entire brain down. But that's not really a way to go about society, to, take the Jordan Peterson approach and just give everybody a bunch of Xanax. That's not the fast track to a functioning society either. So
that's true.
I think it's worth pointing out, though, that a lot of that kind of rhetoric resonates with people who, I think, maybe from a biological perspective, are more susceptible to fear-based messaging.
Right, and I've also read in studies that there are certain things that can be done to raise that level of I don't know if it would be hypnosis, but almost a hypnotic effect, that give that feeling of euphoria, that feeling of being a part of something bigger than yourself, kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then when other people attribute that to, say, it's a spiritual, you're speaking to God in this, or you're on a different realm, that then you kind of buy into that without recognizing that you can have those same emotions with anything else that has that same component. For instance, if you're at church and they have music, if you listen to Christian music, it has such sort of a rhythm to it, and it builds and builds, and then it goes down and it builds and builds. A lot of other music has that too, but it's the type of thing that almost subconsciously, whether you want it to or not, it just kind of builds this feeling of emotion within you, and makes you feel like what they're talking about or what they're focus on is true. It kind of helps with that, and pulling away from that can be extremely difficult. Basically, I'm agreeing with what you're saying, and I also think that when people that you value and trust and look up to tell you that X is true, you're more likely to believe them and not even think about trying to get more evidence for that. And so that can also buy into that. I think those are some, and that's for either religion or politics or anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I think critical thinking skills are something that ideally would be employed more often. When people have trusted sources, I think that's a lot of the emotional component coming back into play, where there's that almost like shut off of the critical thinking in a way, where it's like, I like this person, I trust this person, what they're saying is probably true. I think that's potentially a contributing factor to how people wind up falling into various religions, is that maybe somebody who was a church congregant, or was the pastor, the rabbi, what have you, help them in a way, or maybe they're the neighbor and they get along really well and they just like them, they're a nice person, they're friendly, and so there's kind of that like halo effect where
Mm-hmm.
nothing they say or do can really be wrong, because they have this perception of being good. So I think that, again, circles right back to the brain of how we perceive things and how that stacks up against reality. And that really just goes to show that perception is a very powerful driver too.
Right.
That's one of the, again, not to bring up psychedelics, but like that's one of the components that psychedelics do affect is, perception of things. So it could be that, there's certain brain patterns and brain wirings that make people's perceptions different, and maybe a certain setting of perception allows people to view religion as more favorable or something that they'd be more interested in, as far as an activity to participate in. But again, we don't really have that like good ground level assessment of like different states of perception in the absence of any additional substances, let alone under the influence of any of them, or even within a church setting. So that's kind of where I wish a lot of the cognitive aspects of neuroscience would go, is, and that's where they are going to some extent. There's been a lot of technological revolutions recently I won't get into, but um, looking at how brains are wired, neural networks, the activity of said neural networks, and the things that you do that kind of plays around with them, plays around with the actual biology of brain cells, and how that kind of adds up to what we see in terms of behavior and religiosity, conspiracy theorism, all the like.
Absolutely. We have a super chat. Whoop, whoop. Thank you, Aaron, for your $5. What do you think is more influential on creating a person's personality, experiences, or biological hardwiring?
Ooh, that's a really good question. And this is actually something I dig into a lot when we talk about the philosophy of science. And this is actually something I dig into a lot from a wildly different direction. We talk about this from the aspect of scientific racism a lot. Because you'll hear a lot of essentially scientific racists, but most of them are older, a bunch of them are younger, but you'll hear the same arguments coming from them that we're simply a product of all of our biology, we're hardwired this way, certain racial demographics allegedly have lower IQs, and then you dig into it and you found out there's a million flaws in their methodology and they're just abusing techniques to be racist. But going back to the super chat question, are our personalities shaped by nature or nurture? And the answer is ultimately we're never going to know. I think there's a lot hardwired that we don't understand in terms of how the brain works, and we should absolutely be doing what we can from a research perspective to dig into that. There's probably some degree of heritability, I think, in our lived experiences, and we can absolutely perceive that some aspects of us are like our parents, some aspects of us aren't. Sometimes we share aspects of our personality with our siblings, sometimes we don't. So we can kind of perceive things in terms of familial relation, and that kind of hints at the heritability of these traits. But we can't necessarily point to like, oh yeah, this is the friendly gene and this is the angry gene. It's not something we can really reduce to genetics, which then now invokes nature or the environment in terms of how we are raised, how we're brought up, and how that influences the aspects of our personality. Absolutely, people who live through childhood abuse of various forms, who grow up poor or malnourished because they can't afford food, their personality development, their brain development is going to be magnitudes different than somebody who grew up privileged with parents who loved and cared about them and grew up very sheltered and privileged again. So to add like the meta level of analysis back onto that, how someone's environment is as they're growing up and as they're kind of forming their personality and kind of developing neurologically over the course of their more formative years, that's going to change based on what the environment's like. And that change then changes subsequently how they interact with their environment and modify their environment, which could then again act back on their personality, their biology. So there's this interplay of genes on environment on genes. So this environment modifies biology, which modifies environment idea, that really makes it difficult to like firmly decouple nature from nurture. It's always going to be a mix of both, and it's very difficult to really pick one or the other because of that. But
Right.
again, they both contribute. They absolutely both contribute. I think the most ideal set of circumstances would be favorable genetics, which is just a luck of the draw. For things that we do know about in terms of brain development, risk of physical and mental illness. There's definitely some genetics underlying that, but environment can absolutely either mitigate or prevent some of those things from manifesting, depending on what we're talking about. And we don't have the complete understanding of that, which is why it's so important to, I think, address material conditions from a biological perspective. You want to take the genetic luck of the draw that you got and make the best that you can with it. So that's why I think it's important to make sure that nature doesn't take priority over nurture. I think they both need to have their time in the spotlight.
Right, absolutely. And I know that there's been some interesting studies done on identical twins, especially those that have been separated, either through adoption or family issues or whatever. And it's interesting because they found some similarities in personality, but also quite a few differences. And so I do think you're right. It is both the nature and the nurture. But it's really interesting the things that tend to be more nature that we've been able to see are more nature versus the things that are more nurture. I just think that's quite fascinating. And we don't have all these answers. We're just scratching the surface, I think. So.
Oh yeah, I would agree. I think we're licking the tip of the iceberg, but I would also say, even if we finally, figure out how many licks it takes to, get to the actual water level, it really should be something to where like that shouldn't be the end all be all. Like we shouldn't just approach it solely from a biological perspective, because I think that makes us more closed-minded than we should be.
Yep, absolutely. So there was also another question. How can I learn to use this? He was talking about this person, because I don't know who it was. It was with one of us at Skeptic Haven, about the hypnosis type of a thing, and how we, those things that are, that we know can kind of lead to that hypnotic kind of suggestibility. How can I learn to use this to help me convince people to do what I want? I think that's quite funny.
Hey, I mean, look, if we all had the secret to, whip out the pocket watch and create an army of minions to do our bidding, I think we'd be employing it by now. And interestingly, that probably underlies a couple of conspiracy theories. So I think something that really could be a valuable tool that is, I think, adjacent to hypnosis is this idea called biofeedback. Or I think that's more of a, something you do in conjunction with a professional, with a counselor or therapist, somebody who's trained, who knows how to do it. I think in terms of something the individual can do without involving any professionals, meditation is genuinely something that has similar effects. It's not quite a full-blown hypnotic state, but it can absolutely, one, alter the biology, make people more calm, make their breathing more shallow, lower their blood pressure, kind of help them explore different headspaces, things like that. But at the same time, biofeedback is something that has worked for a fair amount of people. It kind of involves, thinking about either, prior events or headspaces and how that impacts biology, and kind of using biological parameters, blood pressure, respiratory rate, things like that as a surrogate to be like, okay, let's figure out how you perceive these things that happen in your life. How do they make you feel? How is that, what is that doing to your body? And, kind of going through processing these events and trying to, either move past them, rewire some things, and using biology kind of as an output to see if that therapy was successful, if that counseling was working. So with that being said, I don't think there's a way to like hypnotize people, but you can kind of hypnotize yourself. I think hypnotism, or more accurately, biofeedback and meditation, those can actually be tools for self-improvement. And of course, the more people you loop into that, I guess the more people doing it. So you could have your bootleg hypnotism cult if you really felt like it. But at the end of the day, it would just kind of resemble, a congregation of Buddhist monks just meditating all day.
Yeah, that's true. It's kind of funny. As you were talking, what I kind of thought what was going through in my brain is, one of the stereotypical things that we hear about the effectiveness of hypnosis is helping people to quit smoking. And there's, people who swear it helped them quit smoking. I wonder, do you think it's more the placebo effect, or that they believe it so much because they actually went and paid probably a lot of money for at a hypnotherapist? Or do you think that there might be some aspects, maybe not hypnosis, an actual hypnotic state, but that there's something that's going on in their brains that they don't necessarily can't control, not the placebo effect, but something else that actually is happening that's effective with the hypnosis?
Ooh, that's another really good question. If we're talking people who, if the example is smoking cessation, right? If we're trying to talk about not smoking cigarettes anymore, I think it's probably, whether it's hypnosis or another tool, it's about something that resonates with the way your particular brain is wired, which is why I think there's such a different swath of like things that have worked well for different people. Some people have that wiring where like they can go cold turkey, but then something happens in their life, and that original sort of neural network in their head kind of starts reactivating again. It's like, hey, you want to go smoke a cigarette? Like, this shit's stressful. Go take a smoke break. You need it right now. Um, that works for some people. Hypnosis might take people who are especially suggestible and kind of help dampen those signals coming from the addiction, all of the neural networks involved in nicotine addiction might kind of dampen that and almost like expose people to like a different headspace that they aren't used to occupying. So I think it might be almost a way of like drawing out biology that's already sort of latent or nascent to their brains. But at the same time, at the end of the day, belief is a very powerful thing. And that's why clinical trials are double blinded, because if people have expectations about something, that can absolutely influence the medical outcome. So again, it's probably a combination of both realistically, but the biological component in terms of that specific example, stopping smoking or stopping any addiction, it's not as understood as we would like. And obviously there's going to be a lot of ethical parameters in terms of how we study that. We can't just, take a bunch of, alcoholics and give some alcohol and give others water, because there's going to be, withdrawal effects, and they're going to be hurting and in pain as a consequence. Or we can't necessarily, hypnotize them and then expect them to not drink anymore, because there's still a lot of like things that are biologically hard coded as far as the alcoholism is concerned. So it's really just going to depend on the person's genetic background, how their brain's wired, how long they've been at it, which might suggest it's a harder thing to break. But again, people, I think, underestimate the neuroplasticity, or the ability of the brain to change its own wiring to form new connections. And things that you do, whether it's hypnosis or going cold turkey, a support group, talking to people on Reddit, having a sponsor, something like that, depending on the context, might potentiate or increase the amount of new connections that are formed in the brain because of things that are going on in their environment, in their daily life, to kind of offset or dampen the very strong hardwired addiction circuits in their head. So all that to say, there's no real broad answers, but I think context really matters when you approach that question, because there's just so much different stuff that works for other people that there's a lot of, I think, valid approaches to give it a shot.
Yeah, now you're starting to get into some of the things that are like in my field. I get all excited because, I deal with trauma. I specifically deal with child trauma. And one thing that we often say, because this is true, is that the triggers or the events that that cause long-term trauma for these kids, it's that the repetition of negative stimuli. So you have someone who is hurting you over and over and over. You never know what's going to cause them to blow up, and it's some serious stuff. It starts creating a pathway in your brain. That's what we say. You have this pathway in your brain that causes you to react in a certain way as soon as you hear or see or smell or taste something that that puts you in that place of that trauma. But it doesn't mean that you're always going to be there. With interventions and the right type of therapy, trauma informed or trauma focused therapy, you can change those pathways in the brain. It's just like when you have animals that are walking through the forest or through brush, they kind of beat down a path. But that doesn't mean that has to be the only path. They might take a detour, and all of a sudden that's no longer the beaten path, something else is. And we can actually do that and focus on that in our brains with things like trauma. And so you saying all of that, just kind of, I had to say that because that's my thing. We can actually change it.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth kind of bringing that into the discussion. I really like the analogy of, a beaten path, because in our brains, that's kind of what all of these, pathways really amount to, is a beaten path. And not only can you almost unbeat the path, but you can just make a whole new path, like you
Mhm.
mentioned. I think if people, again, the power of belief is very impactful on neurobiology. So I think if people have that belief that, like, yeah, I can forge this new path in my brain, it'll make it more likely. Now, to what extent, I don't think anyone will ever know, but you want to try and get as many things operating in that person's favor as humanly possible. Belief, I think, is absolutely a component that should be central, because that beliefs almost got them into the trouble in the first place, depending on the context, and beliefs might help
Mhm.
them get out.
Yep, absolutely. So we have about 5 minutes left, and I kind of thought it would be interesting. It's not really along with the topic of the brain, but you had mentioned it quite a few times,
Mhm.
and so I thought I would give you the last 5 minutes to talk about academia and your uh, kind of your soapbox on that, because we talked about that behind the scenes as well, and then you mentioned it several times throughout this. So I wanted to give you that time to kind of tell us what those issues are and your stance on it, and maybe if there's something that we can do to help.
Absolutely. I will never shy away from an opportunity to talk about the issues with academia. As a current grad student, I live them every day. So a lot of them are very near and dear to me, because these are things that happen all the time. Currently, I think the one thing that I will try to give a platform to as much as I can is 48,000 graduate students and postdoctoral fellows in the University of California system are currently on strike. There are a ton of labor issues in academia. There's a whole array of things that they are striking for, but it's the biggest worker strike in academic history. They have currently started week 2, and what they're advocating for includes higher stipends, actual health insurance that isn't terrible, um, more vacation time, appropriate working hours, things like that. Now, they have a whole list of things that they're trying to bargain for. And they should absolutely get all of these things, because the University of California system has $156 billion in assets that they could absolutely allocate to the graduate students and the postdoctoral fellows. But more broadly speaking, academia is rife with labor abuse. People get paid below the poverty line. I'm certainly
Mhm.
included in that. At my university, 20% of graduate students can't even afford food. And the city that I live in is stricken by a big housing crisis, which means a lot of grad students are having to essentially live in pseudo anarchist communes just to get by with 10 roommates, because there's so few housing arrangements for anybody to actually survive on. So obviously, there's going to be some context depending on the place, but a lot of academia is centered around generating capital and using graduate
Mhm.
students and postdocs as a tool to do just that. Obviously, I think what we were alluding to, sort of in the pre-show, was that there's a lot of other abuse in academia that's also quite rampant, in terms of sexism, racism, homophobia. The more identity politics focused issues are a giant problem too. A lot of researchers feel that their laboratory power gives them the ability to abuse their trainees in various ways, shapes, and forms, which is something that's certainly come to light in recent years. And there's a lot of, again, advocacy for um, more transparency and accountability frameworks in academia for these kinds of issues. I think finally, in terms of academic issues, one of the final things I'll say is that there tends to be this almost like neoliberal sense of purpose in academia. Not to bring politics too much into it, but it feels like academia these days is more about churning out products and commodifying things, rather than sort of exploring the true frontiers of human knowledge. There's always that meme picture, you can kind of Google it on Google Images, but kind of describes the degree of knowledge that a PhD creates in the entire body of knowledge. And it's just like this teeny tiny little budge in a circle. But if enough people do it, the circle of knowledge continues to expand
Mhm.
outwards and kind of radiates. But it seems like the rate at which that happens these days is really slow, because we're more concerned with sending products to the market instead of actually learning things that can be more impactful on people. So my hope is that there's a big cultural shift, which seems to be swelling with younger generations of academics, grad students, and postdocs. That academia is really about using this training, the scientific method, and the tools that academia has at its disposal to actually learn things to help people and make society better, rather than just feeding the stock market. So in a nutshell, those are the three, I guess, academic issues that I'm the most passionate about. I could actually probably share a link to donate to the strike fund for the grad students who are currently on strike at the University of California system.
That would
It's
be
actually
great.
givebutter.com/UCAW. I will stick it in my chat. I think Titan might be able to share it with yours. Obviously, the longer their strike goes, the more likely they are to get the things that they actually need to survive. So any contributions from anybody, I've certainly put some money in there, but whatever they can get, they will absolutely appreciate to help grad students fight the good fight.
And just spreading the word is something that's impactful, because the more that people learn about it across the U.S., the more pressure will be put on the university to alter. Because you're right, they do get a lot of money, and I have seen and experienced myself what you're talking about. It is ridiculous. I now have interns that come to me to where where I work, and I want to have a better generation. The next generation needs to be better than we were, and so I'm in a nonprofit. I can't offer much, but I do talk to the schools, and I say, listen, what are you guys giving them? Because they're doing work, and most internships are free. And I've seen the abuse of that, but that is perpetuated by universities and colleges, kind of saying, hey, we want to give you this intern. You don't have to pay for them. They can do all this work. As long as they meet these specific goals, you can just use them. So it's not just what happens in research and so forth. It's also what ends up happening with undergrads with internships, or those who are going for their masters and stuff with those internships. It's the whole system. And I'm going off on my tangent now because I agree with you. It's terrible.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it takes a person with a bunch of letters after their name to see that these problems are problems. I think even people outside of academia can see, like, oh yeah, that all of that is absolutely objectively terrible. So I actually put the link to the strike fund in the side chat.
Titan put it in
perfect.
our chat too, so that's good.
But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think it resonates, and like you said, awareness is another big deal, because it generates pressure for all of the issues. Not just the current labor strike right now, but also if there's a particularly abusive faculty member, for example, that can absolutely put public pressure on university administrators to actually fix the problem.
Yeah. Well, we are past the hour, and I want to be respectful of your time, but I will tell you this. I feel like we could go on. As you've been talking, I have more and more stuff, and so I hope that I can have you back again. We just lost him. But I will continue because we are over time. So, he's back. Yay.
I don't know what happened there. I literally, you were like mid-sentence, and then StreamYard was like, nope, you're done. All right, get out. So hop right back in.
That happens. But I hope that we're able to have you back on soon, because I really enjoyed talking with you.
Yeah, that was a good talk. I agree. We could probably go on for hours.
Absolutely, we could. Yeah, because everything, we didn't even get to a whole other topic that we had talked about backstage. So it would be awesome to have you back on again.
Yeah, that would be awesome. I'm sure we could probably set that up.
Awesome. Great. So for those of you in the chat or who will watch this later, I want to thank all of our viewers. If you like what we like what we do and you like to see it continue, the easiest ways and free ways are to like, subscribe, share, hit the bell, all those good things. But if you want to do a little bit more, think about joining our Patreon for special perks. And I want to thank our current patrons, Michael Wiseman, Kathy Cotton, Cindy Plaza, Deborah Grace, Aaron Coalson, Phil Calderone, and myself. I want to thank our producers, Wes, Phil, and Kat, and the booking team, Wes, Raymond, Ellie, and Correa. And we have other shows on Skeptic Haven that I would love for you to check out. We have Secular Soapbox, Women Atheist Unload, Global Atheist, and The Bible Says What. So there's always something for all of you. So I hope that you come back. Check us out again next week. We're always here on Mondays. And in the meantime, remember to always think critically. Good night, everybody.